the Channuka prayer Nusach states these words: Al hanisim va'al hapurkan va'al hagvuros va'al hateshuos va'al hamilchamos she'asisa la'avosenu b'yomim hahem bezman hazeh. We thank you for the miracles, the redemption, the mighty deeds, and the victories in battle which you performed for our ancestors in those days at this time. The Hasmonean revolt lasted 30 years, with virtually non-stop fighting between the years 167 and 160 BCE, in such battles as Wadi Haramiyah, Beit Horon, Emmaus, Beit Sur, Beit Zachariah, Adassa, and Elasa. Matisyahu had 5 sons: Yehuda, Shimon, Yochanan, Yonasan, and Elazar. Gentile historians refer to the 9 worthies, the military geniuses of the ancient world, and state that 3 of them were Jews: Yehoshua, King David, and Yehuda the Maccabee. The other 6 being Alexander the Great, Hector, Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, King Arthur, and Godfrey of Bouillon. In order that we gain some appreciation of what milchomos, battle, close quarter combat, meant, this is a depiction of the Battle of Beit Horon in 166 BCE by the well-known historical author, Jewish-American author, Howard Fast, in his famous historical novel, My Glorious Brothers. The name of the Greek general at this battle was Nicanor, and it is written from the perspective of one of the Hashmonaim, Shimon the Maccabee. Straight through the valley towards Modi'in, Nicanor came, with 9,000 men in heavy armor, marching them along the way we took as children, going to the Beis HaMikdash with the Adon Matisyahu. They had set out from Jerusalem in the early morning, and though our 20s harried them in every pass and defile, they came on under their raised, locked shields. From Jerusalem to Givon to Beit Horon, they marched under a rain of the slim and deadly cedar arrows, so that Nicanor learned once and for all what is meant when a Greek speaks of the deadly, snake-like Judean rain. And all that distance they left there dead in the sun. And yet Nicanor would not be diverted, but marched on, burning the empty villages they passed. At Beit Horon they camped for the night, but all night long our arrows pattered and whispered upon their tents. And though they camped, they did not sleep, and in the morning, with taut nerves and deep hatred, they came down the valley towards Modi'in. And 3 miles from Modi'in, where a peaceful brook ran through the valley bottom alongside the road, where the hills and terraces slope up almost vertically, bare of anything but twisted brush, we built our barricade and blocked their way. Our tactics were no longer new, yet Nicanor was new to them, because every defile in Judea was a death trap. An entire generation of mercenaries lay buried in Judean soil. Yet Nicanor came on into the pass, into the trap, because there was nothing else for him to do. We stood in his path, and either he must sweep us aside or retreat to Jerusalem, considering that he would get there. He chose to sweep us aside. Behind the barricade we put 800 of our best men, armed with spear, sword, and hammer. The rest we deployed on the hills with their bows and their knives, and with bundles of thousands of the short, straight, needle-sharp arrows. The barricade was rock and dirt and brush, 8 feet high and 20 feet thick. Not the shelter of a wall, but an impediment to a phalanx. Our men manned it, and a few yards in front were Reuven, Yehuda, and I standing, watching the great metallic mass of the mercenaries creep down the road behind their locked shields and their bristling front of long, unwieldy spears. They filled the full 80-foot width of the valley. They walked in the brook, they crowded the mountainside with their shoulders, and ever and again one of them would pitch forward, held for a moment by the very mass of the phalanx, cheek or eye or brain transfixed by one of our arrows, and then falling to the ground under the metal-shod feet of the others. They were close enough for us to see now their angry, dirty, sweat-glistening faces, close enough for us to feel what it meant to walk for hours in the burning Judean sun, carrying 80 pounds of hot metal, close enough almost for us to smell on the morning wind the hot, sickening stink of their unwashed bodies and of their leather in their harness. The clang of their metal filled the pass, mingled with the wild shouting of our archers and the deep thud of rocks flung from above, with the screams of the wounded and the sobs of the dying, with the short-breathing, corrupt Aramaic filth that spewed from the mercenaries' lips. And then, no more than 50 yards from us, they paused. 5 men led them, one of whom was Nicanor, and he came towards us with his arm raised, and the noise and shouting fell away, and the rain of arrows halted. "Will you talk, Maccabee?" Nicanor cried. "There is nothing to say," Yehuda replied, his voice cold and piercing. "You killed Apollonius, Maccabee, and he was my friend. With all your rotten Jewish tricks and traps, you slew him. Do you deny that, Maccabee?" "I killed him," Yehuda said. "Then I make a pledge to you, Jew. I pledge that today I will kill you with my own hand and open the pass and clear that Jewish scum from it. And from every olive tree in Yehuda, a Jew will hang, and in every synagogue a swine will be slaughtered." While he spoke, he came on, and Yehuda walked towards him. Nicanor carried a shield, but his sword was in his scabbard, and Yehuda wore neither shield nor armor, only the long sword of Apollonius, slung over his neck and before him. Like a tiger Yehuda walked, clad in white linen pants and sandals, bare to the waist, the long supple muscles rippling as he moved, and like a tiger he crouched and sprang. Few men knew his strength like I knew it. Nicanor tried to fend him off with his shield while he dragged his sword from the scabbard, but Yehuda wrenched the shield aside, and through the sudden roar of sound we heard the bone in Nicanor's arm snap. With his bare hands Yehuda killed the Greek with 2 terrible blows to the head, and then lifted the body, swung it above his head, and hurled it onto the spears of the driving phalanx. The roar of sound obliterated all else. Yehuda ran back, and 100 hands reached down to lift us to the barricade. The phalanx drove towards us, met us, scrambled at the barricade, when I saw that, like men gone mad, our Jewish archers were pouring down the hillsides into the valley, fighting with rocks and knives, and with their bare hands too, filled with mad, wild, terrible hate, filled with the accumulated agony of a decade of senseless, cruel invasions, filled with the memory of countless murders, innumerable rapes and tortures, endless burning and destruction, filled with the rage of free men who had never asked more than their freedom, filled with the memory of desecration and insult and woe. Then, at that moment, if the mercenaries had had a leader, if they had held, if they would not have been packed so tightly at the valley bottom, they could have done what they had come to do. But the death of Nicanor and the wild willfulness of our charge broke their morale. The front ranks tried to give back from the barricade, and the rear ranks drove up against the front ranks to overwhelm the barricade. And from the barricade our spearmen caught the fever and hurled themselves down. There were 9,000 of them, and less than 3,000 Jews. And for 5 long, awful hours we fought there in that valley bottom. Yehuda and Yonasan beside me, in a frightful, hellish slaughterhouse. Much of that fight I have forgotten. Much of it the mind could not retain and exist. For never was there a fight like that before, and there never will be again, not even when the end comes. Yet some things I remember. I remember a pause once, as men must pause and rest when they fight, and I stood in the brook, and it ran red against my legs, thick and sluggish, the blood overwhelming the water. I remember walking on dead men 5 deep, and I remember being caught in oppressor bodies where no man could raise an arm, mercenaries and Jews, face to face, shoulder to shoulder. And I remember when, for a long moment, we stood clear with the dead around us, piled 5 feet high, but no living thing within 10 yards of us. And finally it finished. It was done. We had triumphed. Fighting hand to hand and face to face, we had wiped out a great army of mercenaries, yet at what a cost. In that terrible valley of death, less than 1,000 Jews stood on their feet, and every one of them was covered from head to foot with blood, naked from the battle, a blood-soaked rag hanging from shoulder or hip, and every one of them was cut and bleeding, so that blood dripped from their bodies and joined the spongy blood-soaked earth at their feet. I sought my brothers, but in that nightmarish place all men looked alike. Sobbing, weeping with exhaustion and fear, I called them, and they came to me, Yehuda and Yonasan and Yochanan too, but Yochanan wounded so deeply that he had to crawl over the dead, yet struggled to his feet that he might stand and be among us. Thus we won a victory, and as Yehuda said as we dragged our aching bodies and our moaning wounded to Jerusalem, a victory without triumph, a victory without joy. Now we have some small understanding of why we thank Hashem for Allah Milchamos, for the close quarter battle victories.